Okay, there are a few problems at the end of section 4.c that ask you to not only find the total return, which is a percentage of what you paid um, for for buying stocks or some sort of investment. This is where you were purchasing 50 shares of some stock at $80 per share. So if you multiply 50 shares times $80 per share, you'll find that $4,000 was spent on those 50 shares. We can compute that easily with the calculator by computing 50 shares at $80 per share, which means 50 times 80 is the total paid on the stock, on the 50 stocks. So going back to the problem, you'll see that they sold it 5 years later at a price of $5,700. So you need to first find the amount of profit made, which is the difference between what they paid, what they sold it at versus what they paid for it. So the difference between 5,700 and that's how much they sold it for, and the amount that they paid for it. And if you divide that amount that they earned on the stock by the amount they paid for it, that will give you the total return as a percentage. It will actually show up as a decimal on the calculator, but you have to convert it to a decimal. So the $1,700 made on the stock divided by the $4,000 spent on the stock is 0.425. That's the decimal form of 42.5%. So going back to the problem, you'll see sometimes the answer won't have a decimal involved. This one does, so it's 42.5%, which is the total return on the stock over the 5 years. The more tricky of the two problems asks for the annual return, and the formula is the value you sold the stock at divided by the value you paid for all the stocks, raised to the 1 over y power if you sold it y years later, all minus 1. So since this problem involves selling the stock after 5 years, you're going to divide the 5,700 by 4,000, which is the amount spent on the stock, and then raise it to the 1/5 power, and then subtract 1. There's a couple ways to do this. The raising it to the 1/5 power essentially takes the fifth root. So going back to the calculator, if we divide the 5,700 by the 4,000 sold, you'll see some familiar numbers. It's going to be 1.425. That just means the stock is worth 142.5% of what it was initially. That's why you gained 42.5%, because it's 142.5% of it now. If you take the fifth root of this, why the fifth root? Because you sold it 5 years later. There's a couple ways to do that. On my calculator, I can take the fifth root by pushing 5 and going into the math menu and pushing option 5 to find the fifth root of 1.425. And once you get that value and subtract 1, that's the decimal form of the annual return. So you do have to round to 3 decimal places so that the 4 would make this 3 stay a 3. So your answer would be 0.073, but you'd have to move the decimal over 2 places in order to convert it to a percent. It should be 7.3%. Another way to find the fifth root of 1.425 is to take 1.425 to the 1/5 power. This can be tricky on different calculators. I'm going to use the exponent key, and my calculator actually will divide 1 by 5 if I put 1 divided by 5. I'm going to put parentheses around them because on most calculators, you would probably have to have parentheses around the 1/5 to make sure that the calculator would find that exponent of 1/5 first, which implies the fifth root. And then after raising that to the 1/5 power, you have to subtract 1. And notice that still gives you the decimal form of 7.3%. You can do all this in one fell swoop. So the problem before, you could have jumped right to the total rate of return by taking the difference between the original value. I'm just going to have to go back to the problem to remind myself. You sold the stock at 5,700 and you spent 4,000 on it. So if you subtract 5,700 minus 4,000 and you take that difference and divide it by the 4,000, that's another way to get the answer to part A right off the bat without doing it step by step. You notice that if you divide the amount earned on the stock by the amount paid on the stock, that will also show you the 42.5%, which is the answer for part 1. The answer for part 2 can also be done all in one calculation by putting the quotient of the amount you sold the stock at divided by the amount you paid for all of the stocks, all raised to the 1/5 power. Again, I'll use the exponent key and put 1/5 in parentheses, just because many of your calculators would need that. And I'm going to get out of exponent land and then subtract 1. And that's going to be the decimal form at 7.3%. So if we just go back to check that part B, the second part, is correct, when we convert that 0.073 to its percent form by moving the decimal over 2 places to the right, 7.3%.